This is the third video in a series in which I'm going over my response to Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit. This is the reissued 2006 version from the original 1992 version. And what I think the most interesting part of my response to Al Gore and his accusation that Plato is at the root of the spiritual crisis that's motivating the ecological crisis, the most interesting part of my response involves my theory that Plato secretly paralleled the plot structure of the Republic, his most famous and possibly most influential dialogue, on Euripides' tragic play, the Bacchae, which was his final play, which was published or performed after he had already died. It won him first prize at the Dionysia, the competition of tragic and comic plays for the god Dionysus. I discussed the overall plot parallels in the first video. Then in the second video, I just mentioned some synchronicities that seemed to demonstrate how this conversation of the parallels with the Bacchae and the Republic seemed to be archetypally resonant with the zeitgeist of the day. The idea of a blood sacrifice to be paid, the god Dionysus being ripped to shreds and then reassembled. I discussed all of that in the second video. In this third video, I'm going to go over Gore's argument more carefully. I'm going to read from his book, and then I'm going to briefly explain how his solution to the Platonic essence of our spiritual crisis is actually the acme of Platonic philosophy. So I agree for the most part with what Gore is saying. And even his accusation of Plato is reasonable to a degree, although the irony is, again, that the ultimate culmination of Platonic philosophy, which is opening the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, is also Al Gore's recommended solution to this problem, which he furthermore relates to quantum physics and holographic, the theory of the holographic nature of the universe, which was first put forth by David Bohm in 1980. And so I'll be discussing how that holographic theory of the universe evolved after I wrote my master's thesis responding to Al Gore's book. Ultimately, I ended up writing a dissertation for a PhD on holographic string theory. So I'll also be discussing how this holographic paradigm that Gore points to as the solution to our spiritual crisis that's causing the ecological crisis was already preordained in Plato's philosophy. And I mentioned that in the first video. So another thing I want to mention at the beginning of this video is that my ultimate purpose for putting out these videos is to provide a framework for a national conversation about fundamental philosophical questions, ultimately coming down to what is a self? What is the individual self? Is it an eternally reincarnating soul, like Socrates suggests in the dialogues? Is it an illusion that arises from an ever constantly changing flux of sense perceptions, as, for example, David Hume implies? And what I'm arguing is that in this particular context of the conversation that Al Gore introduces in his book, Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit, I think is ideally suited to provide a framework within which to contain this unifying endeavor. Even if we end up disagreeing with each other on fundamental questions, just the act of engaging in a conversation about how we define our fundamental terms in this Platonic framework elevates the conversation and inclines the people towards unity. So the idea of the good, Plato's ultimate form, the source of the spiritual world and the material world, I define as the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites, which is also how the psychologist Carl Jung, in conjunction with the quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli, defined what Jung called the archetype of the self, or the God archetype, or the one, or unus mundus. And when I mention unus mundus, I will also refer you to another series of YouTube videos I made called E Pluribus Unus Mundus, where I discuss how to apply these ideas of the equation of the soul with the gravitational singularity and the encompassing horizon of the cosmos as described by holographic string theory. I mentioned this in the first video. I'll be going over it again in this video. But the point is how to unite the nation around a common understanding of at least the fundamental terms of some definition of the self within a comprehensive and self-consistent cosmology. Even if we disagree on how we identify ourselves, to clarify what we mean by the terms we use is itself a unifying act. And I'm also going to be arguing in this series that studying Plato, especially reading through the Republic, it's like walking down an initiatory ritual path. And that is revealed more clearly by the parallel with the Bacchae, some kind of an Orphic mystery religious ritual unfolding of concepts intended to trigger some kind of a psychological leap to a higher understanding of the cosmos and the self and the idea of the good. So for that reason, I'm going to press. So I'm arguing that just by studying Plato's Republic, even if the rational understanding of the arguments that he makes goes over our heads sometimes on subconscious level, the collective unconscious level of the archetypes, which I'm equating with Plato's absolute ideas that exist out at the horizon of the cosmos. Just by studying Plato's personality and the sequence of concepts down which he guides us in the Republic, it has some kind of an effect, a powerful effect. It did on me. I know it's had this kind of an effect on many other people. So these are interesting things to talk about. Actually, I want to go to a quote from the master's thesis that I did. I want to make sure that this is still working. Yep, it is. So this whole conversation, I'm launching it off of the master's thesis that I did for Georgetown University for a Master's of Liberal Studies degree. And the title is In Defense of Plato, a Response to Al Gore's Earth in the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit. And in that thesis, one of the things that I want to point out here is in the Republic, Socrates, he's talking to the young men, mostly Plato's older brothers, Glaucon and Adimantos, and he's developing an ideal city-state in order to find justice in the city, and then he'll extrapolate to the smaller pattern of an individual soul to find out what justice is there. And they're developing the ideal curriculum for the ideally just society. And in the conversation, he says, I forgot, I said, that we were playing and spoke rather intensely. Forced labors performed by the body don't make the body any worse, but no forced study abides in a soul. Therefore, you best of men, I said, don't use force in training the children in the studies, but rather play. So it's a playful spirit, I am arguing, that Plato reveals by secretly paralleling the plot structure of the Republic on the Bacchae, especially because in the Republic he depicts Socrates evicting tragic plays, and the tragic plays by Euripides in particular, which he accuses of promoting and hailing tyranny, which is what Socrates is arguing against. The fundamental question of the Republic is, what is justice? And the sophist Thrasymachus, trying to sell his wares to teach rhetoric to the young men there, says justice is the advantage of the stronger, meaning might makes right. Socrates rejects that definition, and the whole conversation starts from there. So he argues that Euripides praises tyranny. Now, as a bit of a spoiler alert, I'm going to argue that Socrates fundamentally did agree with Thrasymachus, but not in the way that Leo Strauss is accused of interpreting that secret alignment with Thrasymachus. But I'm arguing that justice is the advantage of the stronger from Plato's perspective, as expressed through his martyred mentor Socrates, because God is the strongest. And this parallel with the Bacchae indicates that Dionysus is the god being talked about. Not necessarily, I'm not saying that Plato believed Dionysus is God, but at any rate, he used the materials that the culture was providing him as a symbolic language to describe what he believed were these fundamental absolute ideas, what Jung calls the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So it's a playful spirit that I hope can help the nation center our conversation around Al Gore's argument, which he says this is the fate of the earth depends on us understanding how Plato's philosophy has influenced us, especially as it evolved through René Descartes and Francis Bacon in the Enlightenment. Okay, so let me just read bits and pieces here from the book. So this is Earth and the Balance, Ecology and the Human Spirit, Al Gore. Oh yeah, you know what? Again, before I start reading through the book, another reason that I think it's important to look to Al Gore to lead this national conversation is just because of who he is. He was elected to the United States Congress in Tennessee in the 1970s. He became a senator in the 80s, and then he became vice president in 1992. And he served as the vice president to President Bill Clinton for 8 years. And then he ran for president in the year 2000, and he won the most popular votes by about 500,000. But he lost in the Electoral College, which came down to the state of Florida, the governor of which was Bush's brother, Jeb Bush. So there's a lot of controversy about that, probably one of the most controversial elections that we've had. Hanging chads was an issue. But at any rate, it seems appropriate if I'm trying to engage the people of the United States of America in a national conversation, that Al Gore be the leader of this conversation, at least initiating it with his book, because the majority of the people of the United States who voted in 2000 voted for him to be their president. He could have been their president. The Electoral College said he wasn't, and it came down to a controversial decision. But at any rate, this is a person who is a key figure in the history of American politics. So another thing I want to say is that I don't know of any other politician who is framing the problems of the world and of the nation within this kind of a philosophical context. Part of the complexity of this issue with Al Gore and the election of 2000 is that the Straussian cabal, the so-called Straussian cabal of neoconservatives, who are intellectually guided by the Platonic political philosopher Leo Strauss, they were certainly talking about the influence of Plato on Western civilization. Alan Bloom, whose translation of The Republic I'll be using, in 1987 published Closing of the American Mind, which was a landmark in neoconservative thought. So there was, in that respect, high thinking and a high academic level about Plato and how Platonic philosophy influences American democracy. Al Gore brought that same Platonic concern into his book, and he furthermore unites it to quantum physics and holography, as I mentioned before. So I agree with most of his analysis of the causes of our ecological crisis, of the spiritual crisis that led to the ecological crisis. And I really agree with his idea of the cure, which is seeing ourselves as one with nature in the context of quantum physics and how consciousness and matter interact with each other, which we'll talk about. And quantum physics as perceived especially through the holographic paradigm, which evolved to holographic string theory. Okay, so I've got all that preface down. So now let me just start to read bits and pieces from his book, focusing on how he links the spiritual crisis back to Plato. So on page 217, he says, in the words of Dave Foreman, a co-founder of Earth First, quote, "It's time for a warrior society to rise up out of the earth and throw itself in front of the juggernaut of destruction, to be antibodies against the human pox that's ravaging this precious, beautiful planet. So then Gore mentions in parentheses, some deep ecologists, it should be added, are more thoughtful. But then he goes on to say, beyond its moral unacceptability, another problem with this metaphor is its inability to explain, in a way that is either accurate or believable, who we are and how we can create solutions for the crisis it describes. And now here's where he begins his analysis of the history of Western thought. Ironically, just as René Descartes, Francis Bacon, and other architects of the scientific revolution defined human beings as disembodied intellects separate from the physical world, Arne Næss, the Norwegian philosopher who coined the term deep ecology in 1973, and many deep ecologists of today seem to define human beings as an alien presence on the earth. It is a modern version of the Cartesian denouement of a philosophical divorce between human beings and the earth. So there's this fundamental argument that because of the philosophy of René Descartes, the French mathematician and theologian, we've inherited the belief that human beings are intellectual creatures who are separate from the earth. We are not of the earth. The earth is like a prison for the soul. That leads back to Plato. So continuing here, moving over to page 218, he says, the Cartesian approach to the human story allows us to believe that we are separate from the earth, entitled to view it as nothing more than an inanimate collection of resources that we can exploit however we like. Okay, so now I'm going to move to page 230, where he picks up this argument again. And he says, every culture is like a huge extended family, and perhaps nothing more determines a culture's distinct character than the rules and assumptions about life. In the modern culture of the West, the assumptions about life we are taught as infants are heavily influenced by our Cartesian worldview, namely that human beings should be separate from the earth, just as the mind should be separate from the body, and that nature is to be subdued, just as feelings are to be suppressed. To a greater or lesser degree, these rules are conveyed to all of us, and they have powerful effects on our perceptions of who we are. Okay, so skipping down a paragraph, he goes on to say, like the rules of a dysfunctional family, the unwritten rules that govern our relationship to the environment have been passed down from one generation to the next since the time of Descartes, Bacon, and the other pioneers of the scientific revolution some 375 years ago. So that's over 400 years ago now. We have absorbed these rules and lived by them for centuries without seriously questioning them. As in a dysfunctional family, one of the rules in a dysfunctional civilization is that you don't question the rules. So he'll get into this theory of a dysfunctional family and how the rules of a dysfunctional family express themselves in an entire civilization. I'm going to bring that back to Plato's Republic and the Bacchae. Now, the Bacchae is a tragedy featuring Dionysus returning to Thebes to avenge his mother's good name and to avenge his own claim to being the son of Zeus. And his cousin is King Pentheus. King Pentheus's mother, Agave, said that Dionysus's mother, who was Agave's sister, Semele, got pregnant by some man she wasn't married to, and that her father Cadmus made up this story that she was impregnated by Zeus, and then Zeus incinerated her because of that blasphemy. So Dionysus returns to show, no, she was the wife of Zeus, I am her son and the son of Zeus, and he had his own cousin, King Pentheus, ripped to shreds by the women of Thebes, whom Dionysus drove mad. The point here is this is a dysfunctional family. The tragic stories are all about dysfunctional families taken to the logical extreme. So the problems of a dysfunctional family that Al Gore talks about are highlighted in all of the Greek tragic plays. So it's just an interesting point of conversation. Again, I'm trying to create this national conversation, which can, I hope, would expand internationally, but I'm especially focused on the United States of America, because it plays the leading role in the world today politically, similar to the way Athens was the center of power in the Mediterranean world prior to their defeat to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. which figures into our conversation here, because let me just reiterate this fundamental plot parallel. In the Republic, Socrates is in the Piraeus discussing what is justice with young men in the house of the elder Cephalus and his son Polemarchus. In the beginning of the Republic, Polemarchus sends a slave boy out to arrest Socrates and Glaucon after they had watched a festival for the goddess Bendis. And so they're arrested. And then they're forced to go back by the majority vote to Polemarchus' house, where they discuss what is justice. And then halfway through the conversation, in Book 5, they make a gesture to arrest Socrates again, more in an intellectual way. And I point out the parallels with the Bacchae about how that Dionysus was arrested by King Pentheus' slaves at the beginning of the play. Then he's put in jail and he escapes by causing an earthquake, and he's threatened with arrest again. But then he drives King Pentheus mad, has him dress up as a Maenad, lures him out to Mount Cithaeron, where he's placed on the top of a pine tree. The Maenads, the mad women of Thebes, pull him down and rip him to shreds. In the Republic, Polemarchus, who initiated Socrates' arrest twice, just like King Pentheus initiated Dionysus' arrest, he is not killed in the Republic. But in a point of historical fact, he had already been assassinated by the 30 tyrants in the Piraeus, the port town connected to Athens. He was assassinated by the 30 tyrants, the oligarchic group of people who overthrew the Athenian democracy after Athens lost to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And that, I'm arguing, is the historical fact that serves as the endpoint to complete the parallel with the Bacchae that Plato included. So in his art form, he's incorporating fiction, which is the Republic, a fiction resembling fact, resembling the attitude and spirit of Socrates, and he's tying it in with historical fact. These are all parts of this. If you want people to study, you can't force them to. It has to be in a spirit of play. So these interesting parallels, when you see how they correlate, I think that's just an inherently fun thing to look at. Okay, so we were reading in Earth in the Balance about the dysfunctional family of Western civilization, which he linked back specifically to René Descartes and Francis Bacon, but he's going to take it back farther to Plato. Okay, so now I'm going to go to page 248, where he says, a little more than 300 years before the birth of Christ, Greek culture and philosophy were introduced throughout the lands conquered by Alexander the Great. So I'm going to skip over now to 249. He says, as the world discovered, the greatest Greek philosophers were first Plato and second Aristotle. The most significant difference between them concerned the relationship between the intellect and physical reality, or, in other words, between humankind and nature. Plato believed that the soul exists in a realm quite apart from the body, and that the thinker is separate from the world he thinks about. But Aristotle felt that everything in our intellect comes from the senses, and thus the thinker is powerfully connected to the world he thinks about. This dispute began in ancient Greece and continued throughout the early history of Christian thought, through the Middle Ages and up to the 17th century. And he goes on to talk about how St. Augustine recounts how attracted he was early in the 5th century to Plato's view of the physical world and how he struggled to overcome his love of Platonic theory. So let me stop there for just a moment. So Plato and Aristotle. All right, he'll go on to talk about this famous picture by Raphael of Plato and Aristotle. Plato's depicted pointing up, Aristotle's depicted pointing out. And it has to do with the theory of forms, the absolute ideas. So let me just describe Plato's theory of absolute ideas. According to Plato, especially if you look at the dialogues, the Phaedrus, which some people pronounce Phaedrus, and the Republic and the Timaeus, the absolute ideas. So according to Plato, anything that you see in the material world, like this pen, which I often use as an example, Any temporary material form that you might see is radiating from some eternal, perfect, archetypal form of that thing. The absolute idea of pen, the perfect, eternal, unchanging idea of pen exists out at this outermost sphere of the universe, where a soul can go in between reincarnations in material bodies. This material world is an illusion projected from these absolute ideas, a temporary illusion, which is furthermore, in the Republic, in the cave allegory, compared to a prison for the soul. So Plato certainly did call the material world and earth a prison for the soul. And only souls who are overcome by ignorance and delusion identify themselves with the material body. So it does make sense for Gore to point to Plato as the source of an earth-hating mentality. But that accusation, though it's partially legitimate, is undermined by Plato's theory of reincarnation. He says all materially embodied souls have these eternal souls. Souls are absolute, eternal parts of the absolute idea of the good. Souls are eternal, and they're all imprinted with all of the absolute ideas that exist out at the horizon of the cosmos. But they reincarnate through different bodies, and different bodies have different levels of awareness. But the point is, according to Socrates, as portrayed by Plato, all of the species are ensouled. And human souls sometimes take the bodies of animals even. And this is very important for where we're going with this parallel between the Republic and Euripides' play, the Bacchae. In the Republic, it ends with a near-death experience called the myth of and Socrates mentions the soul of Orpheus, after he dies, choosing to take the body of a swan, because he had it with the human species and he didn't want to deal with women anymore because women ripped him to shreds, just like Pentheus was ripped to shreds by women. But the point is, for an ecological analysis of Plato's philosophy, Plato believed all the species, plants and animals and humans, are all ensouled. So the idea of this world as a unensouled, mechanical, dispirited entity, that came about with Descartes and Bacon. And Gore does make that distinction, but he doesn't clearly explain how Plato definitely said that the entire universe is ensouled. And not only that, each of the species is a reincarnating soul. So while it's a prison, it would still imply that we should have sympathy for all of the other species on the earth. And also this emphasis on these abstract ideas imprinted on the soul and on the horizon of the cosmos in Plato, this kind of a cold, detached, scientific attitude towards the universe, is compensated in a complementary way by the parallel with the Bacchae, featuring this nature god, Dionysus, the god of wine and love and dance and song. It's a very earth-friendly worldview. A very earth-friendly worldview, by the way, which we find in the Republic, in the first ideal city that Socrates imagines, which culminates culturally with the people laying down on blankets with their children, feasting on a vegetarian feast, with wreaths of ivy on their heads as they sing of the gods. It's a very Orphic image. Glaucon says, oh, that's a city fit for pigs. Oh, you want a feverish city? Very well, we can do that. And then they imagine the more popular feverish city, which in Book 5 features the guardian class of men and women exercising together naked, and furthermore, engaging in this communistic lifestyle that involves incestuous sex, based on a noble lie that they were all formed under the ground with one of four metals in their soul, so that nobody knows exactly who's mother and father and brother and sister. Some rules are set up to avoid incest, but it's admitted sometimes it will occur. I point that out because that's a big parallel with the Bacchae, where King Pentheus, after Dionysus drives him mad, becomes intensely curious to see what he believes will be a drunken orgy of his own female relatives, his mother and aunts, who he believes will be naked and drunk and having sex out on Mount Cithaeron. Okay, So continuing here with Earth in the Balance, I read about St. Augustine. Oh yeah, so another point. So I did this master's thesis for Georgetown University. Then I got a degree in political science with a concentration in alternative futures or alternative political design at the University of Hawaii with Professor James Gator. That's why I went there to study with him, because I knew he would let me contemplate how to incorporate the spiritual implications of quantum physics to some political design, which is something that Al Gore seems to be talking about here as well. Then I got a PhD in philosophy and religion with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I wrote my dissertation. It was entitled Psyche Equal Singularity, which I then published as a book. And here it is, Psyche and Singularity, Psychology, Jungian Psychology, and Holographic String Theory. So in that book, I discuss St. Augustine, and I say how he also said that the ideas that are all contained in the idea of the good according to Plato, St. Augustine says, these are ideas in the mind of God, and the mind of God he equates with this outermost sphere of the universe, which is incredibly important because that is where the evolution of academic physics culminated. So you had Newtonian physics, and that is what René Descartes and Francis Bacon, this helped to initiate and helped to forward with their understanding of mathematics and the scientific method and this mechanistic view of the universe, that the universe is like a big machine made of little bits of insentient matter, little atoms of unthinking matter. Then the history of physics evolved 200 years later with Einstein's special theory of relativity in 1905. So roughly 200 years later. Then his general theory of relativity in 1915. Then quantum mechanics in 1927. Then a fundamental problem in the history of physics was that quantum mechanics and general relativity don't mix. General relativity describes things at the largest scale, and it describes gravity as the curvature of the fabric of space-time, and quantum mechanics studies nature at the smallest scale. And that culminates with the wave-particle paradox, which has so many philosophical implications. But there's one nature, you would think there's one law of physics that explains nature all the way up and all the way down, and that is where string theory comes in. Although the strings are so small that they can't be observed with the technology available to us today. Leonard Susskind, formerly professor at Stanford University, he defeated the great late Stephen Hawking in the Black Hole War, about information conservation in black holes. And Leonard Susskind combined relativity theory, general relativity, and quantum mechanics in his theory of holographic string theory, the culminating implications of which are, they explain that the past, the present, and the future of every cubic volume of three-dimensional space is interwoven and recorded out at this horizon of the cosmos, this spherical border of the universe where, from our geocentric perspective, the fabric of space-time seems to be expanding away from us in every direction at the speed of light. And it radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang on these elastic strings of energy, which are too small to detect, so a lot of people say that this is empirically unverifiable. On these elastic strings of energy, that information projects back in to create what Susskind calls the cinematic hologram of three-dimensional space. This is essentially what Plato was saying in the cave allegory, as the great physicist and string theorist Brian Greene points out. Although he says that the cave allegory seems to be an inverted version of holographic string theory. I explain that apparent inversion in my book, and I will be discussing it, if not in this video, in subsequent videos. Okay, so holographic string theory was predicted by Plato in his dialogues, and St. Augustine adopted that philosophy, that ultimate claim that the absolute ideas of creation from which creation radiates exist specifically out of this outermost sphere. Okay, so continuing here, I'll just read this again. One of the most influential thinkers in the early church, St. Augustine, recounts how attracted he was early in the 5th century to Plato's view of the physical world and how he struggled to overcome his love of Platonic theory before he could rationalize his acceptance of Christ's true message. So St. Augustine did accept Christianity, and anything that the Catholic Church at the time rejected from Plato's philosophy, he also rejected, but he incorporated a lot of Plato's philosophy into Catholic dogma. Now, continuing here, Gore says, indeed, this tension, which still exists, has been described by the theologian Michael Novak as, quote, the great temptation of the West. For example, throughout the first 5 centuries of Christianity, the heresy of Gnosticism, which portrayed physical reality as an illusion, drew powerfully upon Plato's conception of a disembodied spiritual intellect hovering above the material world. But even after the Gnostic view was formally rejected, it periodically resurfaced in various guises, and the Platonic assumption upon which it was based, that man is separate from the world of nature, continued to flourish as a major strain of Christian thought. It may have been overemphasized because of early struggles with paganism. So here you see Al Gore explaining the history of Western civilization, which he's calling a dysfunctional civilization, and he's accusing Plato's philosophy of the human soul as an intellectual being hovering above the material world, detached from the material world, as this root source of our dysfunctional relationship with the earth. Okay, so now I'm going to skip over to the next page. And, all right, so part of this conversation was he was contrasting Plato to Aristotle. So Aristotle, he's saying, was the good guy in this ecological disagreement. Actually, this is back on 249. He says, the heritage of Aristotle's thought, on the other hand, was kept alive principally in the Arabic-speaking world. So he's saying that Aristotle said the absolute forms aren't out at the outermost sphere. Al Gore did not mention the outermost sphere of the universe. He just said that, according to Plato, these absolute ideas hover above the earth. Well, specifically, it's the spherical border of the universe itself. Aristotle, who was a student of Plato's in the original academy, which Plato established in 387 BCE, just north of Athens, in an olive grove named after this Greek hero Academus. Aristotle studied with Plato there for 20 years, and he came up with his own interpretation of the theory of forms. He says the absolute ideas, or these eternal forms, don't exist separate from the earth, except for one form, which Al Gore didn't mention. That's the form of God. The ultimate form, equivalent to the idea of the good, Aristotle agrees with Plato. That does exist out at the outermost sphere of the universe. All the other forms, however, are immanent in nature, and they never exist separate from matter. And when matter and these eternal forms combine, the matter approximates this perfect form as much as matter can, and then it fades. And that these forms are therefore more inherent into nature, which provides a more earth-friendly philosophy, says Al Gore. Okay, so influenced by the powerful work of Maimonides, the Jewish scholar writing in Arabic in Alexandria, who reinterpreted Judaism in Aristotelian terms, St. Thomas Aquinas undertook the same reinterpretation of Christian thought and antagonized the church establishment with his assertion of an Aristotelian view of the relationship between the spirit and the flesh, between humankind and the world. So St. Augustine was a Platonist, and he helped develop the dogma of the Catholic Church. About 1,000 years later, St. Thomas Aquinas adopted more of an Aristotelian perspective. However, like Aristotle, so too did St. Thomas Aquinas still point out that God exists at this outermost sphere. And that, I'm saying, is most important because of the evolution of academic physics, seems to have come full circle back to that original Platonic idea, which has enormous implications And furthermore, to open the eye of the soul to this idea of the good, I'm arguing, is to see how the idea of the good, or the God archetype, is the central singularity which exists at each point of the encompassing horizon, which is also consistent with what Plato depicts the astronomer Timaeus describing to Socrates in the Timaeus, where he says that God, or the God, placed the soul of the universe in the central point of the spherical universe and at each of the encompassing points of that sphere. And furthermore, he says the absolute ideas exist out at that outermost sphere, and they project the material forms inward. So this is the philosophy that Al Gore himself says quantum physics and the metaphor of a hologram are the antidote to Plato, and this is going to help us see ourselves as united with nature. That holographic principle, which was developed first by David Bohm, evolved subsequently into holographic string theory, which is even more perfectly aligned with Plato's philosophy than I was mentioning in 2008 when I published the thesis. I still pointed out how similar quantum physics is to Plato, and I cite Heisenberg and Erwin Schrödinger, often referred to as Schrödinger. Al Gore points to them as offering a potential solution to the spiritual crisis that's rooted in Plato. I quote Heisenberg in particular, who was a Platonist. So this is another irony. So let me reiterate this irony. I agree with most of what Al Gore is saying. The one great oversight is that his antidote to Plato is the quintessence of Platonic philosophy. Al Gore says we need to open the mind's eye to God's presence everywhere in nature, bright, shining as the sun, which is so similar to opening the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, which is the source of all of the other absolute ideas from which nature radiates. Okay, so continuing here, on page 250, a classic painting by Raphael in 1510 portrays the same philosophical tension at the beginning of the Renaissance. Plato appears with one finger pointing toward the heavens. Next to him, Aristotle is gesturing toward the earth. Then he goes, but just a century later, the re-emerging Aristotelian view was dealt a severe blow. On November 10th, 1619, René Descartes, soon to become one of the founders of modern philosophy, was a 23-year-old mathematician lying on the banks of the Danube. That day he had a startling vision of a mechanistic world filled with inanimate matter moving predictably in mathematically determined patterns, patterns that could be discerned and mastered by analytical minds through sustained inquiry and detached observation. In a real sense, Descartes' vision initiated the scientific revolution. It is often said that, quote, all Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato, unquote. It's a quote from Alfred North Whitehead. And much of the credit for this should go to the work of Descartes, who broke through the tension in the 17th century between the ideas of Aristotle and Plato with his famous dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Okay, so René Descartes did do what Gore is saying. He specifically divided reality into two types. Unthinking matter extended in space, and thinking substance that's not extended in space. And that includes God and human souls. For Descartes, reason is the essence of a soul. Animals don't have reason. They don't have self-reflection. We are aware that we are aware, and that helps us realize that we exist. Descartes was responding to all of the doubts that were raised against the Catholic cosmology that occurred with the advancement of science, specifically the heliocentric theory initiated by Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and ultimately Isaac Newton, whereas in the Bible, Earth is the center of the universe. This is a big irony with holographic string theory. Earth is also considered the center of the universe because general relativity indicates that no matter where you are in the universe, you will perceive yourself as the central point of an expanding universe. But going back to, so that almost made me lose my train of thought. Okay, so Plato. There's unthinking substance extended in space, and there's thinking substance that's not extended in space. human minds, humans have souls because we have rational thought and self-reflection. Animals don't have self-reflection. They're aware, but they're not aware that they're aware. Therefore, they're fundamentally like machines. They have no rights because they're not living beings, really. They have no soul. They're more akin to machines, says René Descartes. And furthermore, he was a great mathematician. He's responsible for giving us the Cartesian grid of XY coordinates for geometry. And they had this vision that Al Gore's recounting of using mathematics to find the eternal mathematical forms that describe the ever-changing and combining atoms of unthinking matter. So that is an important point that Al Gore is making, that I agree with, and that we have to deal with that. But one point I'll make, when I was writing Psyche and Singularity, a lot of it is based on the psychologist Carl Jung's equation of psychic energy and matter. So following Einstein, and Carl Jung had dinner conversations with Einstein when they were both living in Switzerland. So Jung said, I believe that the psyche is its own entity. It's not a material byproduct of brain chemicals or whatever. It is its own essential entity. And it has its own energy, psychic energy, emotional energy, intellectual energy. It's coming from a soul, not from the body. Well, if psyche has energy, then according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. The units of energy can be converted into the units of mass if you multiply the units of mass by the speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per second squared times itself. So there's an enormous amount of energy in every little bit of mass. Carl Jung was saying, if psyche has energy, why can't we measure its mass? At first he speculated maybe it's because it's so small we don't have technology capable of measuring something that small. But then in a letter to J.R. Smithies on Leap Day, 1953, or was it 1952? It was one of those two. I should absolutely have that committed to memory at this point. He concluded a letter to J.R. Smithies that I call the Leap Day letter with this equation. Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So the highest intensity is infinite and the smallest space is zero. So infinite intensity of energy, where the wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum are condensed to a point, that's infinite intensity. In the smallest space of zero volume, it's the definition of a gravitational singularity. So then I translate his equation, psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space, to psyche equals singularity. But the singularity in the center of the universe, from which the Big Bang is continuing to flare forth, to use Brian Swim's terminology, the famous cosmologist who I studied with out at the California Institute of Integral Studies, according to holographic string theory, that singularity also exists at each point of the encompassing horizon of the cosmos, where the past, present, and future are interwoven at each point, and it radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the cosmic microwave background radiation on these elastic strings to create the holographic movie that we're living in, which is very similar to Plato's cave allegory. Okay, so that's René Descartes. So continuing here on page 250, by the time Descartes had finished his life's work, Raphael's picture was obsolete as a representation of Western thought. The new modern prism pointed decisively upward, away from nature, away from the earth, toward an ethereal realm from which the detached human intellect could observe the movement of matter. I'm going to go back and show that picture again. To observe the motion of matter everywhere in the universe. So let me read that again. The new modern person pointed decisively upward, away from nature, away from the earth, toward an ethereal realm from which the detached human intellect could observe the movement of matter everywhere in the universe. Well, that, I think, is ironic, because one of the biggest pieces of evidence I had for this correlation of Plato's philosophy with holographic string theory came from Carl Jung's near-death experience, which is very similar to the near-death experience at the end of the Republic called the myth of Ur. In 1944, Carl Jung had a heart attack, as he recounts in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He was taken to the hospital, and Then he broke his foot. He was taken to the hospital. Then he had a heart attack, and then he felt his soul leave his body, his psyche. It rose above the hospital until it was about 1,000 miles above the earth. He said he could look down and see the earth, the reddish sands of Arabia, and the clouds. He was above Ceylon, overlooking India. He saw this hollowed out, huge black boulder hollowed out into a temple like the temples he'd seen in the Gulf of Bengal. Inside, he saw a black Hindu in a white robe sitting in the lotus posture, and in the back of that black rock temple, he believed all the people to whom he belonged in reality lived. His doctor, Dr. H, rose above the earth and said, "The earth has need of you," something to that effect. And then he woke up and he recalled that it seemed to him as if each of us in the three-dimensional world lives in our own little box of illusion, tethered to the horizon of the cosmos by a thread, and that the past, the present, and the future are interwoven out at this outermost sphere of the universe, where he furthermore experienced the archetypes of the collective unconscious during these nightly visions he had for 3 weeks after his near-death experience, which began each night around midnight. So, this convergence of physics bringing us back around to Plato's original philosophy, which Jung experienced during his near-death experience. There's a further irony here because Leonard Susskind presents his theory as the allusion to intelligent design. He's an atheist, or at least he portrays himself as an atheist in his books. He says he's not an atheist in YouTube videos I've watched. He alludes to reasons why, even in his books, in the endnotes, where he mentions if you bring up some kind of spiritual implications of holographic string theory, then you might lose your funding. But at any rate, this holographic string theory is presented in an atheistic light, although ironically, it's giving us a confirmation of the ultimate theistic philosophy, which we find in Plato's dialogues, or at least the most influential theistic philosophy. And whether Plato believed in God or not is a controversial issue, and I'm arguing that he did, and strong evidence for that argument is the underlying plot parallel with the Bacchae, which is a theistic text featuring the god Dionysus. Okay, so again, here's this famous picture that helps us conceptualize what Al Gore is talking about, and he believes that Aristotle's the way to go, and that Plato is the this way lies death for the earth. So I'm going to continue reading here now on page 252. Floating somewhere above it all, this new disembodied mind could systematically and relentlessly decipher the scientific laws that would eventually enable us to understand nature and control it. The strange relationship between spirit and nature would later be called that of the ghost in the machine. Okay, here's a point that I'm going to make. If Plato's philosophy, which inspired René Descartes, is this earth-hating philosophy, how is it capable of giving the human species godlike power over nature? He'll go on to say that we uncovered the blueprint of God's design. Well, it would seem that that is evidence for the divine nature of this mechanistic philosophy. There's just this tension here. I'm agreeing with what Gore is saying here, and he's right to point out how this unlocked the secrets of nature, but how can you, on the one hand, say that this philosophy of René Descartes, and he'll go on to explain in Francis Bacon in the scientific method, it can give us insights into the God's blueprint for nature, and yet it's somehow against God and against nature? It's just, it's not a total paradox, but it's a point that I think needs to be explained. He goes on to say the church, meanwhile, was supposed to be on guard against any Faustian effort of the people to gain unseemly power to alter God's world. But it fell victim once again to the Platonic vision by reducing its spiritual mission to an effort to guide the inner life of the mind while discounting the moral significance of humankind's manipulation of the natural world. Now he's going to introduce Sir Francis Bacon. Sir Francis Bacon, Lord Chancellor of England, author of The New Atlantis, 1624, and one of the principal founders of the scientific method, undertook to ease any doubts the Church might have about allowing humankind to acquire and exercise the vast new powers of science. Taking Cartesian dualism one step further, Bacon argued that not only were humans separate from nature, Science, he said, could safely be regarded as separate from religion. So skipping down, he says, thus began the long 350-year separation of science and religion. The astronomical discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo earlier upset the Church's peaceful coexistence with science, but neither man had intentionally challenged the primacy of the Church's moral teachings as the basis for interpreting the new facts discovered from observing the universe. However, Bacon suggested a moral detour. Facts need not be considered in light of their implications. Skipping down a little bit, he says, the fundamental shift in Western thinking, which in a very real sense marks the beginning of modern history, gave humankind increasing dominance in the world as a flood of scientific discoveries began unlocking the secrets of God's blueprint for the universe. But how could this new power be used wisely? Descartes and Bacon ensured the gradual abandonment of the philosophy that humankind is one vibrant strand in an elaborate web of life, matter, and meaning. And ironically, major scientific discoveries have often undermined the Church's tendency to exaggerate our uniqueness as a species and defend our separation from the rest of nature. So, he goes on to say, yet science itself offers a new way to understand and perhaps begin healing the long schism between science and religion. So now he's going to offer quantum physics and the idea that we're all interwoven with nature like a hologram as the antidote to Plato. Earlier in this century, the Heisenberg principle established that the very act of observing a natural phenomenon can change what is being observed. Although the initial theory was limited in practice to special cases in subatomic physics, the philosophical implications were and are staggering. It is now apparent that since Descartes reestablished the Platonic notion and began the scientific revolution, human civilization has been experiencing a kind of Heisenberg principle writ large. The very act of intellectually separating oneself from the world in order to observe it changes the world that is being observed, simply because it is no longer connected to the observer in the same way. All right, so he mentions Heisenberg. Now again, Heisenberg was himself an overt Platonist. So I'm skipping now to 254. Although many scientists resist the notion that science can ever be reunited with religion, there is now a powerful impulse in some parts of the scientific community to heal the breach. While Plato tended to emphasize the eternity of existence rather than the concept of creation, and while Descartes' mechanistic explanation also implied an eternal world, many scientists who have had no use for religion in the past now believe that the evidence from recent breakthroughs in astronomy and cosmology points toward a definite beginning for the universe. Some have, as a result, softened their resistance to the notion that the universe and humankind as a part of it were created. Arno Penzias, for example, who shared a Nobel Prize for his discovery of the measurable echo of the Big Bang that accompanied the beginning of time, was asked on a radio call-in show what existed before the Big Bang, and he said nothing, the implication being that the universe was created from nothing, so that the idea of God as a creator was reintroduced with the Big Bang Theory. Now, this Big Bang Theory is enormously important for my interpretation of Plato, especially the Timaeus, where he says the soul of the universe at the beginning of the universe was placed by God in the central point, which encompasses the outermost sphere, where the absolute ideas exist and from where they project the temporary material forms of three-dimensional space. That's what holographic string theory says, and it is consistent with the Big Bang Theory, which Al Gore is pointing to as evidence for God. So we see how Al Gore, his solution to Plato is, again, the acme of Platonic philosophy. That's the great irony, I'm saying. So continuing here, on page 254, Gore says, indeed, there is even, in this emerging scientific view, a palpable physical role for human thought in the shaping of reality. Erwin Schrödinger, a pioneer in quantum physics, first offered the astounding view that consciousness is one of the building blocks of the physical universe, and that a shift in the attention of an observer can have tangible consequences in the locations and physical properties of subatomic particles. The two-slit experiment, which I'll talk about. I'm going to save this for the next video. We're already almost an hour into this video. I'm just laying out Gore's argument, and then I'll respond in more detail in the next video. But the two-slit experiment, where if you observe which slit the particles go through in that famous experiment, then they act like little particles. They line up right behind the two slits and create two vertical lines on the detector screen behind them. If you're not observing which slit the particles go through, photons, electrons, or whatever quantum particle, they go through as waves of probability. They split into two new little waves which radiate out from each slit and interfere with each other, so that the peaks and valleys cancel out and the peaks amplify, so you get a series of bands all across the back detector screen of light and dark, the dark bands being where the valleys and the peaks of these waves of probability cancel each other out. So I want to now continue here to, here's another important point that Gore brings in. He said on page 255, "My own curiosity leads me to this speculation, that the original scientific impulse, before Descartes and before Plato, was made possible by the conception or revelation of a single creator. When Akhenaten first conceptualized a single God, and when Judaism introduced the idea of monotheism, it became possible for humankind to develop a new understanding of the nature of the things they beheld in the world around them." So he says, continuing down on page 255, "This process of spiritual triangulation identified the natural world as sacred, not because each rock and tree was animated by a mysterious spirit, but because each rock and tree was created by God." So he talks about triangulation when you're sailing. You have to have two different points, a constellation of stars, for example, where you are, and some other point where you're trying to go. He said he'll go on to explain more thoroughly here on page 256. He says, "Many centuries after Akhenaten, Plato's intellectual inquiry followed an entirely different path. Although he searched for a single cause behind all things, he attempted to discern their nature by locating them in relation to only one point of reference, human intellect, rather than through a process of philosophical triangulation, which would have relied on 2 points, humankind and the creator, or what would also be called a single cause. By assuming that the human intellect is not anchored in a context of meaningful relationships with both the physical world and the creator, Plato assured that later explanations of the workings of the world would become progressively more abstract." Well, again, I point back to the Timaeus, where Plato very distinctly talks about the creator God placing the soul of the universe in the central point and in each encompassing point of the outermost sphere. So Plato was also philosophically triangulating our relationship with the creator, also known as the idea of the good in all of nature. So again, I disagree with Gore's analysis of Plato. I partially agree with it, but I point out big flaws with it. But despite those big flaws of his understanding of Plato, I agree with his understanding of the evolution of the scientific age of enlightenment from Descartes through Bacon into this mechanistic cosmology, which has caused this ecological crisis. Gore says that we are addicted to consumption of the earth. We have this godlike power given to us by the Platonic, Cartesian, Baconian scientific worldview, but we don't have the godlike wisdom to how to that helps us use it properly. And so we are devouring the earth to try to fill the hole in our souls where a relationship with the earth used to be. And I agree with that as well. So now, on page 258, he says, "The strange absence of emotion, the banal face of evil so often manifested by mass technological assaults on the global environment is surely a consequence of the belief in an underlying separation of intellect from the physical world. At the root of this belief lies a heretical misunderstanding of humankind's place in the world as old as Plato, as seductive in its mythical appeal as Gnosticism, as compelling as the Cartesian promise of Promethean power, and it has led to tragic results. We have misunderstood who we are, how we relate to our place within creation, and why our very existence assigns us a duty of moral alertness to the consequences of what we do. A civilization that believes itself to be separate from the world may pretend not to hear, but there is indeed a sound when a tree falls in the forest." Okay, so now I'm going to go to 264, where he lays out his solution, his ultimate worldview that's going to help us realign ourselves with the environment. On page 264, he says, we are not used to seeing God in the world because we assume from the scientific and philosophical rules that govern us that the physical world is made up of inanimate matter whirling in accordance with mathematical laws and bearing no relation to life, much less ourselves. Why does it feel faintly heretical to a Christian to suppose that God is in us as human beings? Why do our children believe that the kingdom of God is up, somewhere in the ethereal reaches of space, far removed from this planet? Are we still unconsciously following the direction of Plato's finger, looking for the sacred everywhere except in the real world? So the ethereal reaches, the irony is that the Greeks call the outermost sphere of the universe the ether. Earth, water, fire, air, ether. And that is where holographic string theory says the past, the present, and the future coexist, and that's where Plato said these absolute ideas exist. So it does make sense to point up. You could just as easily point down, left or right. The point is, if you go out to the horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding at the speed of light, about 14 billion light years away, that's where all of the absolute ideas in the kingdom of God, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, exist. Okay, continuing on 265, it is my own belief that the image of God can be seen in every corner of creation, even in us, but only faintly. By gathering in the mind's eye all of creation, one can perceive the image of the Creator vividly. Indeed, my understanding of how God is manifest in the world can be best conveyed through the metaphor of the hologram, which I mentioned in the introduction. Skipping down a little, he says, when the light of a laser beam shines on a holographic plate, the image it carries is made visible in 3 dimensions as the light reflects off thousands of microscopic lines that make up a distinctive resistance pattern. Each tiny portion of the hologram contains a tiny representation of the entire 3-dimensional image, but only faintly. Skipping down a little, he says, similarly, I believe that the image of the Creator, which sometimes seems so faint in the tiny corner of creation each of us beholds, is nonetheless present in its entirety and present in us as well. If we are made in the image of God, perhaps it is the myriad slight strands from Earth's web of life, woven so distinctively into our essence, that make up the resistance pattern that reflects the image of God faintly. By experiencing nature in its fullest, our own and that of all creation, with our senses and with our spiritual imagination, we can glimpse, quote, bright shining as the sun, unquote, an infinite image of God. So that was the ultimate irony, is that idea of opening the mind's eye to the image of God located in every corner of creation, bright shining as the sun, is a restatement of Plato's ultimate idea of the good, which is the spiritual sun, of which the visible sun is a dim reflection, and that we should study the mathematical laws of the material world that describe the material world to help open the eye of the soul to this infinitely brilliant source of all being. A study of mathematics and astronomy is one way to open the eye of the soul. Another way is the Orphic path of devotion to the God through song and dance. And that is revealed by the parallel with the Bacchae. So we'll pick up in the next video where I'll start to go into the details of Plato's philosophy in more detail.